A major political resignation in Israel, the death of an American president, and a conversation with one of the leading analysts of Iran about what 2025 might bring. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Happy 2025 is the way to talk to about these issues with you.
I think so. Don't you find that Happy New Year just ever so slightly catches in the back of the throat because you think we've already said Happy New Year 3 months ago? That was the actual.
Us Jews, we've had the New Year before you guys did. That's what you're trying to say.
Well, I think it's just that it just for me. I've always thought that the New Year feels like September because it's a change of season. It's Rosh Hashanah. It's the new academic year. It's the new agricultural year, which, of course, as you imagine, I'm extremely close to those rhythms. But no, it just always has felt like that. Where January is just a bit in the middle of winter, So yes, my solution has been to say Happy 2025 to people. I notice people are saying we survived to 25 as if the first quarter century, which I think we noted the other day. This is now behind us, and we are into the second quarter of this new century. How's that working out so far? It hasn't been all sweetness and light, but no, new year, very, very different. Have you made a resolution? I'm guessing Israelis don't make resolutions, do they? For why would you? It's not a big thing, the change of year.
Well, first of all, you mentioned the first quarter. When you mentioned that, my mind just jumped to Tony Kushner's Angels in America when the ghosts of Pryor's forefathers say the world has gotten so terribly, terribly old. We're beginning the second quarter. I mean, wow. Let's hope it's better than the first. Listen, in Israel, it's a thing. The New Year, you'd think it isn't, right? Because you had Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, as you said a few months ago. But it has become a thing. Israelis like to take on the American trends, and of course, with the help of the Russian immigration, Novi God, the Russian New Year as well. There are celebrations. There are, to the extent that Israelis could be celebratory this year. But yeah, it is a thing here. I can't say it isn't. By the way, this year it mixed up with the Hanukkah and all of that. So you had the sort of festive.
Here's my question, and I'll tell you why I asked this. Many years ago, I was a guest on
I feel like this is a trap. I don't know why, but I feel like
it's not going to be a trap. No, I was a guest on a TV quiz show, University Challenge. I was on a team for the Christmas episodes or whatever, and one of the questions was, who is the patron saint of December the 31st? And I said Sylvester, which turned out to be the correct answer because Israelis used to refer to New Year's Eve as Sylvester. And my question was going to be, is that still how people refer to that day, or is that past?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
Can I have the footage of that video of you doing the challenge?
As long as you promise not to upload it onto Instagram or any other of the social media platforms. Yes, I think you can still get it. I think it's on the BBC iPlayer. There was a little team from my alma mater, and we made it all the way through to the final. Did you know that? Okay, so we've done enough about that. Let us get on.
I had embarrassing archive footage of television me in the past.
It's not when I was a student. It was only 2 or 3 years ago. So no, it was when they brought us back years later.
Thank you, Johnny Friedland. You just gave me my 2025 resolution.
To find that footage. There's quite a lot of footage you're searching for, I think. We'll add it to the list. So let's talk about what's been going on in the world. I would say it's a sort of medium-sized political bombshell that dropped. So tell us about that.
I mean, I think that the medium size is the right assessment of it. So on Wednesday, Yoav Gallant, who was ousted by Netanyahu as defense minister less than 2 months ago, decided to also resign from the Knesset, essentially leaving political life. We should say leaving political life for now, taking a break. The reason that he said or stated was essentially saying, I'm focusing on the draft bill. We have talked about this a lot. What has been called the draft bill is actually the exemption from draft bill, a law that should be set in motion by this coalition, which will officially exempt the ultra-Orthodox from military service. This is creating a lot of havoc not only in the opposition and the people who oppose this government, but also inside the coalition itself. Yoav Gallant was one of the main, opponents of this bill as defense minister, which he held that position up to 2 months ago. That was, of course, incredibly important because he was the one who was supposed to present the bill. So if he objects to it, that creates all a matter of mayhem. And he said that is my reason, but he also stressed the fact that he belongs in the Likud. He's not planning to leave the Likud. He said, I voted for them for the first time in 1977, essentially saying, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially trying to say, I am the real Likud. Now, two takeaways from this. One is that I think anyone from the outside would find it incredibly interesting that the Minister of Defense, the man who was Minister of Defense on October 7th, is leaving political life not because of October 7th, but because of his fights or disagreements with, political disagreements with the Prime Minister. And the other thing to take away from this is to understand the real reason for this. First of all, that Yoav Gallant was quite concerned about the attempts in the Likud to say that he is a resigning MK. If they technically label him like that, he can't run in the Likud in the next elections. He'll have to set up a new party. So he wanted to keep all of the options open for him. It's a technical thing. And the other thing, I mean, the Israeli paradox. By leaving the seat vacant, Netanyahu can now appoint or decide to appoint an MK that actually make it easier for the draft bill to pass. If Yoav Gallant was thus far the sort of person holding his ground and saying, you know what, I won't let this pass, now it will be actually a great gift for Benjamin Netanyahu, the fact that he is resigning.
Yeah, that was my immediate reaction to it. I just, once again, it's not the first time. Well, I'm sort of baffled by this kind of decision because, first of all, there's the first level, which is the one you went to, which is there's a kind of chutzpah in resigning, but not resigning because you take the blame or responsibility for the huge failure, lethal failure on your watch, namely October 7th. So there's a sort of, he could almost be a chutzpah nominee for that. But the second piece of it is, given there is no love lost between him and Netanyahu, we know that. Why do something which doesn't hurt Netanyahu, but actually helps him? Surely better to remain there as a stone in the shoe of the Prime Minister, where you are just somebody with a platform, with a vote, who is not with him, than just to say, because I hate you, I'm going to make your life easier. To me, is it just political ineptitude by Gallant, who's just not understood how to sort of play the kind of, the political game, the Knesset game? That's the bit of it I don't get. I understand preserving his future, viability and the technical point you made. But it just politically, it just seems as if there was Netanyahu who was having, a tough week personally. We should mention his, surgery. He was in hospital having his prostate removed and was, out of action for several hours, although officially continuing to work. He told that was what was briefed out, but instead he had a little gift tied up in a nice New Year's bow from Yoav Gallant. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as you mentioned, a gift on a week that was very difficult for Netanyahu, not only medical procedure, but also the fact that he was dragged a day after this surgery to the Knesset because of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who decided to show his show of strength again and to vote against the coalition in a specific budget-related vote. So they had to drag Netanyahu from his hospital bed to vote and to counter this. So again, it's Gallant giving Netanyahu this gift. Look, Yoav Gallant was a general or a military soldier for 35 years, and he's a politician for 10 years. So that does give you a sort of view on what he is more experienced in. All that time, Netanyahu was just a politician, basically. So again, you see that power. I think Yoav Gallant really deeply believes that he will have a place in the Likud, that he is the real Likud, and he will be able to take on that party come what may. I'm not sure he's right about that. He's definitely not right about that as long as Netanyahu stays. And if Netanyahu goes for whatever reason, there are going to be a lot of names fighting for the Likud. And so, I mean, they won't forget. I mean, Likud is a very loyal sort of party. They won't forget a lot of the things that Yoav Gallant, in their eyes, did to Netanyahu. And we should also mention that as defense minister, there were huge disagreements between them, not only around this exemption from military service, around the issue of hostages. Yoav Gallant said, end whatever is happening in Gaza, bring back the hostages, I remind you. Also also around the issue of the day after in Gaza. He has been saying for months, we have to set up some sort of apparatus that, yes, will include the Palestinian Authority because there's no other way. And Netanyahu, of course, objected to this. And the main disagreement is also the State's Commission of Inquiry. Yoav Gallant said it should be set up while knowing that he will be one of the people implicated by it. And Netanyahu fiercely objects. So there have been a lot of, issues here in disagreement between these two men.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of, in American politics, and we'll come on to that, of those Republicans, Nikki Haley types, who imagine that the Republican Party after Trump is going to turn, relative terms, leftward, whereas everyone else looks at it and thinks, no, if anything, this is now a party that will only go further rightward, that the heir to Trump will be Trump-like or even more Trump than Trump. Ditto, I think, the Likud party. It looks to me like they'll be looking again for someone who is in the place Netanyahu is in, or even closer to the kind of Ben Gvir, thrust of politics. The idea that they will instead go back to a kind of nostalgic Likud of a previous era, unlikely, And so Gallant is putting his flag down for a piece of terrain that I don't think exists now, and I can't imagine it will exist in future. Anyway, I did mention we're going to get onto American politics, and that's partly because of the death at the start of the week of Jimmy Carter, the longest-lived American president. He died age 100. And, death of an American president, always a big deal in world affairs. But I think in terms of the part of the world that you and I follow so closely, hard to think of an American president more engaged with that region over, in office, but also afterwards than him. Maybe Bill Clinton as well is somebody you would associate with the Middle East, but otherwise Carter really stands out. He wrote, a string of books after leaving office about the Arab-Israel conflict, about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict specifically. It's been one of those interesting things to watch because the obituaries around the world outside Israel have been almost uniformly positive. That praising him, even when admitting the kind of political limitations, his electoral failure, he didn't get re-elected, one-term president, have been praising certainly his achievements afterwards and seeing him as this figure, a kind of moral figure in the world. And the tributes have been really quite glowing, focusing on, whether it's eradication, the near eradication of, the guinea worm, disease caused by guinea worm, or building houses for the poor with Habitat for Humanity, or going around the world monitoring elections and so on. He had one of the, and never a trace of personal scandal associated with him. He acquired a status which is really sort of outside politics, of a great sort of moral authority, saintly figure almost, outside Israel. Inside Israel is one of the few places where you get people being really scathing about him and sort of vitriolic. And I think that's mainly because of his position on Israel-Palestine. Just one thing I was going to say on it, which is something I don't know whether it was fully appreciated. I heard some of the Israeli sort of commentators saying about him, look, there was a really great thing he did, which was the Camp David Accords, brokering peace between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. That was the good bit. We like that. But the bad bit is everything he was doing afterwards, and where he became this kind of advocate for the Palestinians and hugging Hamas leaders and so on. I think the thing that was perhaps not appreciated is the extent to which they were, for him, two sides of one coin. They were continuity. In other words, he did the deal, the Camp David Accords, Israel and Egypt, but felt the unfinished business of those accords was the Palestinians. Even felt some guilt that he hadn't been able to do something for them, and therefore spent the rest of his life trying to complete that task. And I think he saw it as much more unified than people in Israel have and do.
So you know that my obsession with American politics always has to start from watching the history of the American debates. And so I'm probably one of the few people still alive who saw the three debates between Carter and Ford, 1976. By the way, fun fact, the first one was in black and white. The two others were for the first time in color. Maybe quite a shame that both the president nominees were a bit gray at the time. And of course, the three debates between Reagan and Carter in 1980, where you see a complete crush of Carter, the fact that Reagan was such a big star. You can take that away from him. I don't think Jimmy Carter lost the election because of that, but I think, it's just an interesting thing to see. Look, when you read back, and I know you want to talk particularly about Israel and about the region, we have to say something about Iran as well, because still relevant even now. I think he is such an interesting figure because, look, it's not a small thing. The fact that at the end of the day, he is the man responsible for the most stable and important strategic agreement that Israel ever signed with, we should remember, its biggest enemy at the time, is not a small thing. It's a huge deal. And of course, you needed spectacularly brave leaders in Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. But I remind you, Sadat came to Jerusalem in 1977, an important year in all kinds of aspects. And then it was stuck. The negotiations were stuck, and Jimmy Carter pulled them out of the mud. And he said, you come to Camp David, and you stay there with no communication until you get a deal. I mean, that is unbelievably important. Now, what you mention as later years, we should say that he wrote a book. One of his books was Peace, Not Apartheid. And he, that was the first time that a major American figure used that word in relation to Israel. It is definitely no one since, no American president, former or current, no one used that word when pointing it to Israel. We live today, sadly, in a world in which the word genocide is thrown around like a volleyball. But we have to understand the importance of Jimmy Carter saying in 2006, Israel is an apartheid state. I think from that moment, Ariel Sharon still met him. Ariel Sharon, of course, was not prime minister after 2005. He still met him, but the leaders after would not meet him when he came to Israel. Of course, another thing that was reminded this week, that came out this week, that he calls Khaled Mashal, Hamas leader, of course, involved in October 7th. He called him a great peacemaker. All this is true. I think from his perspective, he tried to make a better world for the Palestinians, what he thought would be a better world for Israelis. I think what Israelis saw, besides, having a hard time listening to him after he said the word apartheid, I think what Israelis saw was the blind spot in not, seeing any agency in the Palestinians' decision-making and not blaming Palestinians for anything, blaming only Israelis. That is the sort of part of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, I think, that was difficult. I will also mention the Iranian story. We can't not. I mean, as we talk about hostages and the American president saying you have to release them until January 20th or else, we should remind our listeners that the hostages, the American hostages in Iran, were actually released on January 20th as, I think, really, historically, Jimmy Carter and Reagan were on their way to the inauguration. To Reagan's inauguration. Reagan was much more tough, at least in stance, against Iran. Carter was considered to be being someone who was less tough. But, all of this is completely echoed in the world we still live in, which is a remarkable thing. And it says something about the Jimmy Carter legacy as well.
Yeah, I think there's so much in there in what you've said. I think the echo is sort of uncanny with this moment of transition from one president to another, Democrat to Republican. Hostages, Iran, clock ticking. It is uncanny. Just on that point, the decision, I think this may be very relevant for people who are looking at Netanyahu's decision making. At the time of that Iranian embassy siege, many voices, including Carter's own mother, were urging a kind of military response and urging the bombing of Tehran in order to get, to revenge for the impudence of taking these hostages. Carter said no, because if we do that, the hostages, there's a high risk, many, all, some of the hostages will die. And therefore, he took the heat there of appearing weak. And that was the word that was really attached to Jimmy Carter, that he was weak. And he did that because he thought that you either use military force or you have to get the hostages out alive. I just sort of leave that there as an echo because obviously military force has been the choice that Israel has chosen with Gaza, and fewer hostages are alive than everyone would have wanted. And so that's there. Just on the apartheid point, I think it's worth saying he didn't quite say Israel's an apartheid.
There are obviously different situations. I think the issue when it comes to Jimmy Carter and Tehran was, did he understand in time that this is a regime that is very different, and maybe trying to appease them is not the right thing. I don't know, but I think that's also a question to pose.
Yeah, and he did try force, and it failed terribly. I mean, not a rescue operation, not a bombing. Look, obviously, completely different situations, but just indicative of, in a way, his mindset. Just on the point about apartheid, the defenders of Carter would say two things. First, he wasn't saying Israel itself entirely is an apartheid state. He was talking about Israel's rule in the West Bank very specifically, which is different from talking about Israel proper. And second, he was giving a warning, saying that Israel will be on course to being an apartheid state. And that is a warning that two Israeli prime ministers have given as well, Ehud Olmert being one and Ehud Barak being another, saying that if it continues in this way. So, but of course, by slapping that word on the cover of his book, he went further than other people had gone. I just wanted to pick up your point about him himself beyond just the Israel-Palestine piece of it, and what a remarkable figure he was. There was this word weak attached to him. I even remember, I have a sort of child's memory of the Carter presidency, but that was the thing. There was this it became a sort of an image that stayed because it seemed to be a metaphor for him, which was when he was taking part in a run. And he was haggard and virtually collapsed, and he just conveyed, people thought he was weak. It turns out he wasn't just a figure of a military veteran and and with connection to the Second World War. He has this kind of action hero past. He was in the U.S. Navy. I just love this particular story. He was attached to the most elite group who dealt with nuclear weapons. At one point, the Canadians had a nuclear reactor that was going wrong. They called on this elite group of U.S. Navy sort of crack forces, led by one Jimmy Carter, where they had to be lowered into the core. Carter, could only be in there, had to be in there less than 90 seconds, otherwise he would risk death. Carter went down in there for 89 seconds. Think action movie. Had to press turn lots of valves and press lots of buttons, was then pulled out again and averted a nuclear disaster. This is the guy who was sort of caricatured as weak. He was an extraordinary person. He lived this sort of epic life, born in, poor rural Georgia, ends up being president, lives a full century. It's an amazing life story. And I think some of the caricatures of him miss that. He's a bigger, larger figure than I think we realized at the time.
Yeah, that nuclear reactor story is an amazing one. Of course, you needed a thriller writer to tell us that story. But look, I mean, obviously he was considered weak because he lost the elections. And even before that, the whole sort of, particularly the economic issues and the recession and the energy crisis, and turning to the American people and saying, I need your help, all kinds of things that, and again, as I said, the person who stood across from him in 1980 was anything but weak. But that is, again, that's image. And as you say, that's not exactly the person that he was. This is a man who was mere 4 years as a president, and more than 40 years as an ex-president.
Yeah.
And I think that his legacy is a much more complex one in both of those titles.
Yeah, I think that's right. And a really consequential figure in the United States and global history. Well, like everyone else, we are looking ahead to what might come in 2025. I think one sure bet that you won't lose a huge amount of money on is imagining that Iran is going to loom large, certainly in terms of how Israel sees the coming year, but also for the incoming American president. And so we wanted to turn to someone who thinks about these issues very expertly and very deeply.
Dr. Suzanne Maloney is one of the foremost authorities on Iran. She is number one on our list when we want to understand the thinking of the Islamic Republic. She's the vice president and director of the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution, focusing on Iran and the Persian Gulf energy. She's advised both Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy, authored or edited 3 books on Iran. Her latest piece for the Foreign Affairs magazine is titled The Middle East's Dangerous New Normal, Iran, Israel, and the Delicate Balance of Disorder. Suzanne, thank you so much for being back on Unholy.
Thanks so much for having me.
I mean, it's always a pleasure, and there's always a lot to talk about. I think last time you were here on August, so much has changed. I mean, Hezbollah is crippled, Bashar al-Assad toppled, Israel withstanding yet another Iranian attack. You write in Foreign Affairs that Israel was successful in this round of direct attacks, but, and I quote, the normalization of direct military conflict between Iran and Israel is a seismic shift that creates a profoundly unstable equilibrium. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think that there is a danger of taking some of the successes that Israel has achieved over the course of the past 6 months in particular, especially with respect to Lebanon and Syria, and presuming that Iran has been neutralized on a long-term basis. I think that, what we've seen in both April and October is an Iranian leadership prepared to take risks in a way that it had never before demonstrated. And, the fact that Iran now has been set back significantly in terms of its regional reach, also in terms of its own domestic deterrence capabilities, does not necessarily make Iran less dangerous. And the fact that you have a leadership that was prepared to take these really, gargantuan risks of attacking Israel in a direct attributable fashion, not just once, but twice, I think tells you something about where the thinking is from the Iranian leadership. And I think we have to take that quite seriously.
And in a way, if we are taking it more seriously, which I get that, especially because it's almost like it's sort of a cornered animal, it can lash out. Can we nevertheless, though, think it is less frightening a threat because, some of its equipment, its arsenal, has literally gone, but also, crucial loss. I'm thinking particularly of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Does it pose as much of a threat, even if it is just as aggressive, because the armies of proxies it had around the region are either beaten or diminished?
Well, I think the axis of resistance is in a very different place than it was until really in the October timeframe. That was the moment when Hezbollah essentially collapsed, and Hezbollah has always been the jewel in the crown for the Iranians. It was the first beachhead that they had in terms of developing this model of proxy militias that they supported and funded, but didn't necessarily wholly control. And Hezbollah over time became what, in a sense, training the trainers. They were, helping to coordinate and arm and manage a whole set of militias, including to some extent Hamas at various points in time. And so, that loss and the loss of Nasrallah in particular, I think, is going to reverberate for a very long time for Iran, and it's going to force a change in their approach to how they exert their influence regionally. But one of the things to remember is that Iran has proven dangerous even at times when its capabilities were much less significant than they remain today. Its ability to kind of regenerate some of these groups, its ability to maintain a vision of a long game. And I think it's also important to remember that Iran, has an ability to fund and attract allies even when it's under great pressure at home, which is also a part of the story today. That domestically, I think the position of the regime is more difficult because of the economic pressures that are on it. So, what you see is, I think, especially with a new administration coming into office in Washington, Iran that is likely to try to demonstrate its capabilities, but also to test the waters of negotiations and to see what they may be able to get from a somewhat unpredictable Trump administration.
So let's talk for a moment about that unpredictability, because it's really hard. Perhaps it's easier for you, but it's very hard to decide where to put your chips on. Does Trump actually, for instance, join Israel in an attack against nuclear sites, or does he do the exact opposite and try to forge a deal with Iran? There have been signs for the latter. He sent Elon Musk to meet with the Iranian ambassador. He said he thinks, Iran could be a very successful country. Where do you think he is heading on this issue?
Well, I think on Iran, as with many other issues, you will see differing tendencies within the incoming Trump administration. There will be, I think, the starting point will be an initial effort to try to ramp up economic pressure again, and it comes at a time when Iran is experiencing a severe internal crisis, particularly with respect to gas availability, which is critical to both the power infrastructure as well as heating for Iran's domestic population. And this has produced, a huge slide in the value of the rial and even some unrest on the streets. There have been strikes in the Bazar-e-Bazorg, which of course is the grand market of Tehran, which played a historic role in prior periods of revolutionary upheaval. I wouldn't overstate that, but I think it just speaks to how dire things are at home. And so if the Trump administration is able to begin to staunch the flow of Iran's oil that has been smuggled out in increasing quantities over the course of the past 5 years, and that could have a significant worsening of the economic situation at home, and that would make the Iranians more desperate. Desperate both in terms of negotiating, but also desperate in terms of how they try to set the table for negotiations. If we think back to the last time the Trump administration imposed its maximum pressure strategy in 2018, the Iranians were fairly patient. They waited about a year, and then they began striking out. And it was a very deliberate effort to try to galvanize the international community on behalf of some kind of a deal. It didn't actually work, but it did draw a lot of diplomats to Tehran. It did create at least an opening. And I think we may see a similar sort of mood again. But there is a question, I think, as to how significantly the Trump administration can really ramp up the economic pressure. They will have to persuade or force the Chinese to significantly reduce their imports of Iranian oil. And there's been no indication from the Chinese that they're prepared to do this. Forcing them to do it will be complicated at a time when the Trump administration is applying pressure to other aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. And to some extent, it will require a much more direct presence in terms of trying to interdict some of these supplies of oil, because they're, part of this ghost fleet that the Russians are also using to get their oil to market. And that involves the use of U.S. military assets. And I want to close here on this point, which is, the question of whether Trump would be willing to support an Israeli military action against the nuclear program. I think it is really the question for 2025. And I can argue it both ways, but I tend to be a little bit skeptical. I think Trump would be prepared to give the Israelis a lot of running room, but he is not prepared to see the United States be dragged into a military conflict in the Middle East. That's been one consistent point of his approach to the world. Even before he got into politics, he has inveighed against the amount of money and effort that was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think he recognizes how unpopular that is with the American people. And so he would draw a very clear line, and he would not, I think, be as supportive of an Israeli military action in the region as perhaps the Biden administration has been to date. And I know that's also been a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, especially for some of those among the Israeli hawks who were really looking forward to a Trump presidency, imagining he's going to be even more with us than Biden. And what you just said there is how that might play out rather differently. Just on the point of Iran and its nuclear ambitions, we had a conversation on the podcast a few weeks back that I think fascinated both me and Yonit, was with Ehud Barak, Israel's former prime minister, who had been in the cabinet as defense minister when there were big discussions with Netanyahu as prime minister over whether or not to attack nuclear sites in Iran. And he said that, look, if the Iranians were to get hold of a bomb, they wouldn't drop it, he didn't think, because they would know it would mean, reciprocal action that would send them back into the Stone Age, was how he put it. And therefore, the inference of that remark was that Israel may just have to live with a nuclear-capable Iran, because on the assumption that they would never use that weapon. I'm just wondering what your view of that is, not necessarily what Trump might view, but what your view is, whether that is sound logic and whether you think the world should get its head round living with a nuclear Iran.
Well, I think the world has already gotten its head around living with a nuclear latent Iran. They have made such dramatic progress over the course of the past few years in terms of their capabilities. And it's, one of the challenges around any kind of negotiation is it's very unclear as to, what kind of a deal we could get with the Iranians at this point in time. They would not be as generous, to however you may define that, as the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. because they're not going to be willing to cede some of these capabilities, and that puts them close enough to nuclear capability. And with the level of current oversight from the IAEA, we don't have an absolute confidence that we know everything that's happening in the supply chain and in any underground facilities that Iran may have developed. So I think we are already living with a level of risk that for many of us would have been considered completely impossible in prior situations. And yet there has been a certain degree of equilibrium despite the drama in the region. I think I would be very discomfited, and I think every American president, including the Trump administration, has said that they would not be prepared to live with a nuclear Iran. And so, the challenge is that this is a regime that has given the means of production of advanced weaponry to terrorist groups around the region. This is a regime that has, an existential need to stay in power. And I don't think that we can trust the Iranian regime with a nuclear capability. The challenge is it's a very big job, and it gets bigger every year to try to eradicate that capability. And it would have such catastrophic implications for the region because the Iranians would no doubt use whatever force they had, both domestically and through their proxies, to strike back.
You're essentially saying that the Trump administration might give Israel some leeway, but it's not going to assist in if there is an attack on nuclear sites, if Israel does decide to do this. And of course, there has been talk among the Israeli defense echelon about this option. Is it really still an option? Isn't everything so tucked down underground that it really doesn't do anything but just convince the Iranians to run faster to try and get a bomb?
Well, I think what we're seeing with respect to the Israeli stepped-up campaign against the Houthis in Yemen and in the strike, especially in October on Iran, is a demonstration of capability. So they're trying to signal to the Iranians that they can, in fact, undertake a really complex set of missions against dug-in targets at a very long distance involving, a large number of aircraft. I don't think that there's a confidence that the Israelis could eradicate the entire program with confidence without American assistance. I just think, in terms of the capabilities needed and the volume of the effort, there is a fairly wide consensus that some American support would be necessary. And you also have to, factor in the expectation that there would be some significant Israeli casualties and potentially Israelis lost or taken prisoner in Iran, and that would lend a much greater set of complications to this mission. So it's not impossible, but let's be clear, even the most optimistic assessments of what a U.S. effort might be able to do or a U.S. joint Israeli effort might be able to do have always predicted that, we'd be able to set back the Iranians for a multi-year period, but not indefinitely, especially because, they have the capability, they have the knowledge. Unless you can be certain that you have managed to take out every scientist, every engineer, every aspect of the military program around the nuclear program, you're not going to be able to be confident that you're not just pushing Iran to go even faster and more furiously toward declared nuclear weapons capability. And that, of course, has all the corresponding implications for the region of a Saudi nuclear capability, a Turkish nuclear capability, this wider proliferation that I think we're all afraid we're going to see over the course of the next few years, both in the Middle East and in Asia.
You've already explained there just how complicated this is and all the implications mentioned there in Turkey or Saudi Arabia. You talked earlier about China. Just to add a further complication, which is where Russia fits into this. And I'm asking this partly because there have been some who imagined, and they may be overestimating simply the diplomatic capacity of an incoming Trump administration, but there are some people who have imagined that Trump will go for this kind of grand bargain of grand bargains. He's the ultimate deal maker. And what he'll try and do is link together Russia and Ukraine and the need to bring that war to an end as he sees it, with Iran and its standoff confrontation with Israel and its proxies and fold it all together and try and get some kind of deal, in a summit, him and Putin knocking heads together. I think that's how he imagines it partly. But first of all, do you think anything like that is plausible? And whether the Russians would stand with the Iranians in some kind of situation like that, or have they just got their hands full with Ukraine and they're not interested in this bigger chessboard that some are imagining?
Well, I think the Russians are definitely interested in the bigger chessboard. Unfortunately, the loss of Bashar Assad's regime and the military base in Syria is no doubt going to factor into what the Russians would expect to hand off their interests on Iran. It's hard for me to imagine that we could get a deal that would be remotely acceptable to, if not the Trump administration, at least Republicans in Congress on Ukraine, that actually is viable with respect to what the Russians would expect for giving up Iran. Now, let's be clear, the historical animosity between Tehran and Moscow is very significant. There's no love lost between the two leaderships. But there has been an investment of more than a decade in terms of the strategic partnership in Syria, and now a strategic partnership around Ukraine. And it's mutually beneficial. And, this is, I think, a more durable partnership than we necessarily give it credit for. So it will be interesting to see how a Trump administration tries to link these various conflicts in a way that might actually produce a durable solution. But, the reality is Putin is not going to settle for anything that leaves, a defensible, autonomous Ukraine and also give up Iran.
I'm going to ask the question from the Israeli who's been woken up by Houthis for a few nights. I mean, the defense echelon here tends to look at the Houthis as a pretty independent proxy of Iran. I mean, what do you think should be done? How much control do the Iranians actually have on the Houthis in Yemen? And what does Israel need to do? It can attack Yemen over and over in the Hodeidah port and Sana'a, but what is the strategy here? What should be the strategy?
Well, I think what we're doing, both from the perspective of the Israelis and the U.S. in terms of actually going after the Houthis directly, is a bit too little, too late. But let's be clear: the Houthis are not an easy group to deter. They don't have the political calculus that even Nasrallah in Lebanon had. They've withstood, a very long siege, and they've managed to actually persist. And that was even before they had the level of assistance and strategic partnership that they have with Iran. They are, in some ways a nihilistic group. They're not looking to achieve, sort of any greater ambitions other than their own survival and their own ideological pretensions. And they have a bit of a trump card, so to speak, which is that, they have held back from the attacks that were persistent during the first Trump administration and up into the early months of the Biden administration against U.S. partners in the Gulf, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular. And if, under pressure, I think one of the challenges is the Houthis may revert to those same attacks on Saudi and Emirati infrastructure. That poses a really significant threat to the economic transformation project in Saudi Arabia and to the wider climate in the region. And so, this is one of the balancing acts that I think both Washington and Jerusalem have to contemplate, which is that, in the larger game is a normalization with Saudi Arabia and formalization, institutionalization of the really effective partnership that we've seen both in April and October, and frankly, over the course of several years between the U.S., Arab militaries in the Gulf, and Israel. That's the real prize here, but it's going to be more difficult if, in fact, we see the Houthis turn their attentions away from Israel and toward the Gulf states themselves. So, how we navigate. You're going
to be waking up from Houthi missiles for a while. That's what I heard in that answer.
I think we can degrade their capabilities, and just as there's still missiles coming from Hamas, and there's still a threat from Hezbollah. But it's significantly different than it was even 6 months ago. So, we can take some actions. But the Houthis have the trump card in that they are just, not going to be a group that we can negotiate with effectively.
I mean, just because you're mentioning there of Hamas and how that is ongoing, Donald Trump has said he wants all this done. I'm talking now about the Gaza front. He wants this over by January the 20th when he swears, takes the oath of office as president. And I've heard people quote that saying, you've got 18 days left, to do X or Y, as if there is something instant that happens. He's saying, solve this or else. And I want to know, what is the else? What is it that what is his sort of threat there or sanction that he has up his sleeve, in a way on both sides, diplomatically on Israel or militarily on Hamas? What does he imagine he will do if he doesn't get his way and see this thing wrapped up, as he has put it, or hinted at it, by the time he takes office on the 20th?
Well, he's made threats, I think, primarily against Hamas. That if there continues to be violence, that he's prepared to sanction and support an even more horrific bombing campaign. I'm not sure that anyone from Hamas is listening to Donald Trump, much as it's not clear they've been listening to any outside parties. But I think, and I don't think there's a reasonable likelihood that a Trump administration in any way would be prepared to, hold back on military support to Israel. In many respects, I think what the challenge may be is a Trump administration that is less prepared to put American lives and American capabilities in the region in the way that the Biden administration has with we have a fairly high force posture in the region right now, not just on the ground, but in terms of the carrier groups that have been in and out of the region on a very regular basis since October 7th. I think a Trump administration really wants to decrease that capability, to decrease that commitment. They will be prepared to sell Israel and give Israel whatever capabilities it might need or want. And they won't be fussy about an Israeli declared end to hostilities. It still involves a hell of a lot of bloodshed in Gaza and elsewhere in the region. But they just don't want to see American troops put at risk. And they also do, with the appointment or the nomination of Bridge Colby as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, he is, a very prominent China hawk and someone who has, with the support of a lot of others in the Republican Party, made the case that the U.S. has spent too much time focused on the Middle East. We've devoted too much attention and too many resources, and we've got to pivot from there, pivot from Ukraine, and move all of those resources to Asia.
All of that is really fascinating because, as Jonathan mentioned, there are so many people here in the Israeli right who are expecting a Trump administration. You're going into the sort of weeds of what that might mean, and it's a different thing, I think, from what many Israelis expect. I have to ask your thoughts on Syria in the sense of, what do you make of Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's trying to show the West all of his, friendly colors. Israel obviously more skeptical because the reality has taught us to be that. But what do you make of him? Is he someone who can talk to the West in a way that might bring a different future to Syria?
Look, in all of the scenarios in the region, I don't think anyone could have imagined what we've seen, even over the course of the past couple of days. The New Year's celebrations around Syria have just been the one note of hope in a very, very, violent and sad period of the region's history. And so I would be very hesitant to make predictions that suggest it's not possible this can continue. I think there are a huge number of factors that are going to complicate the situation in Syria. And we shouldn't sort of move forward with a presumption that simply because they're saying the right things at the moment, that, and we're seeing, in fact, not just talk, but the walk. We're seeing women appointed to significant positions in the Syrian Central Bank and in a governorship. We're seeing, the right approach to minority groups for the most part. So I think that there's a lot of positive momentum. The relationships and the investment that we're seeing being built between Jelani and some of the leadership in the Gulf, very important as well. We need to balance the influence of Turkey with what I hope would be a more, Syrian nationalist approach of the Gulf states. But we're by no means done, and this could fall apart tomorrow, which just means that it's that much more important that we have a United States that is paying attention, that is invested, and I do think some of the names that we've heard for potential people at the State Department and at the NSC would be those who care deeply and understand how critical Syria is in terms of its role in any possible revival of Iran's capacity to threaten Israel from Lebanon, and more generally in terms of the wider stabilization of the Arab world.
This might be the last question then in that case. I mean, what conclusion you have drawn from the Trump appointments so far? It sounds like you are, in a way, encouraged by what you've seen from at least some of the appointments he's made. Because, I mean, in general, they've certainly around the world, they've got what you might call mixed reviews. I mean, he's had a pretty bad press for some of his nominees. I'm thinking of the Defense Secretary Hegseth and so on. But it sounds like you, as a sort of foreign policy thinker, you see some signs of encouragement there.
Look, there are some cabinet appointments that I think, or nominations that will hopefully get a very thorough vetting in the Senate before they are confirmed. The Secretary of Defense nominee, the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and others in the intelligence community, I think, create some real concerns. But I think what we're seeing at a working level and ambassadorial nominations are, they're hardline Republicans. They're not, sort of people who would have served in a Biden administration or possibly even a Bush 1 administration or Bush 2 administration. But they're serious people who know the region, who I think are going to be responsible in the way that they approach the region. And I think that's especially important if there is this effort to kind of pivot away from the Middle East. We need people who understand how important it is that the United States is involved, that the United States is demonstrating leadership, and that we are preserving and investing in our alliances and partnerships in the region, because I think that's one of the places where President Trump himself is not necessarily as invested, and that's sort of a global concern. So, in general, I don't think we can breathe a sigh of relief. We don't quite know. The father-in-law of Trump's daughter, a Lebanese businessman, has been appointed as some kind of a special envoy. What will his role actually be, and will the professionals really be free to go about their business? But I would expect that Brian Hook may be back. We know he's been very much at the center of the maximum pressure strategy on Iran. He knows the country, knows the issue very well, and he, like President Trump himself, has been under threat from retaliation by Iranian operatives for several years. So I think there will continue to be a fairly clear focus on the threat posed by Iran.
Dr. Suzanne Maloney, we always feel smarter talking to you. So thank you so much for talking to us again. And even a little bit encouraged, we should say this time.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, that was a fascinating conversation with Suzanne Maloney, as always. I was interested by what she said at the end, that some of those appointments are, but at the lower level, the ones that haven't made headlines. Some of the Trump appointments actually give somebody like her, who is a serious, credible analyst of these things, some comfort that there are some serious people in those jobs. That means I think we should take a good second look perhaps at some of the lower level appointments. That was interesting. And the other thought was this one about that Iran, even if now weaker, might not be any less aggressive or threatening. In other words, still threatening, maybe the muscle is less strong than it was before, but that doesn't mean the threat has diminished. So I think that is all very, very useful.
Yeah, I mean, and that they are playing the long game. I think it was very interesting, her assessment that while the Trump administration will let Israel have its, have a pretty long running field on the Iranian thing and vis-a-vis the attack of nuclear sites, perhaps not joining Israel, which is something that I think Israelis would have be interested to know. Also saying that the Saudi Arabian game is the right thing to do. I mean, that eventually that is the thing that might stabilize a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia would stabilize the region. There was a lot of interesting points in there, also about the Houthis and about Syria. But as I said, she always makes us feel smarter, so I was very glad that she came on. Awards, sir?
Yes, we should.
2025, make them count.
Yeah, well, I thought we would give the award to a sport we haven't mentioned before on the podcast, namely indoor bowls, whose world championships are due to be held in the English county of Norfolk later this month. Headlines appeared saying Israelis were banned from competing in the World Indoor Bowls Championships. There'd been pressure from some pro-Palestinian activists, and the organisers of the tournament gave way. I think then a few people pointed out that they might be on the wrong side of the law in doing this, and so the invitations were hastily reinstated. But the chutzpah, actually, I want to locate in the statement that was put out by the organisers of the tournament as they announced the withdrawal of the invitation. They said, bowls is and always has been a sport that unites people. And this choice, they're talking about the banning of Israelis, reflects our commitment to protecting the championships and ensuring they run smoothly for everyone involved. I think it's chutzpah to say, when you've disinvited, when you've barred athletes from a particular country from taking part, saying this is a sport that unites people and this ensures that they run smoothly for everyone involved, we've invited. But for everyone else, not so much. It's very easy to claim unity if you exclude anyone who isn't going to be unified. So I think that was a chutzpah to put out that statement. As I say, the decision was later reversed, but a chutzpah award to the organisers of the World Indoor Bowls Championships for claiming, if you want to bar people, but don't claim you're doing it in the spirit of unity and to ensure the safety of everyone involved, or because you've just made sure some people are not involved. Chutzpah.
Perhaps, yep. Look up the word unity in a dictionary nearby.
Correct.
Could be helpful. Maybe it doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah. So we need a Mensch award.
And we want to give it to a man with a very interesting biography. This is Ron Campius. He was the D.C. bureau chief for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency for many years, and for 2 decades, actually. And he stepped down and wrote a really beautiful column. The column is titled "The Blessing and Burden of Bearing First Witness to Jewish History." He writes particularly about October 7th and being one of the few people who could write about it on a Sabbath because he wasn't religious, but also because he knows Hebrew. He worked for, I think, the Jerusalem Post for many years here in Israel. The column starts with a story which kind of surprised me about someone refusing to cover Yitzhak Rabin's assassination for political reasons, which sounds to me really unbelievable, but just about the importance of bearing witness and how difficult it is at times and what kind of story you're telling if you're for 2 decades responsible for the Jewish story, and what have you seen in this year and a half that we've all experienced. I think that is, I think he deserves the Mensch Award for that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was a lovely piece. People should look it up, but also for many, many years. I got very used to seeing the name Ron Campius as the byline on stories covering all kinds of events that we either have or would have talked about on the podcast. He has been a chronicler of the Jewish world, of the relationship between Israel and the United States for many years and many years of distinguished service. So we salute Ron Campius. We should say before we close that, of course, we are now very much there on Patreon. You can become a friend of the podcast, even a family member of the podcast. All the details are on patreon.com/unholypod, all about how you can join there. We will have bonus episodes coming for you if you are a subscriber. There'll be a couple of those each month. Details are all there.
They are indeed, and we will say our thank yous to Michal Porat and to Gili Remen, and we will meet each other next week.
See you then.